Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Savannah Kelly. One of the largest class action lawsuits in Canadian history is likely heading back to court. The federal government wants a judicial review of a recent ruling from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. In October, the tribunal refused to endorse a $20 billion deal proposed by Ottawa and the Assembly of First Nations. The money was for First Nations children who were subjected to a child welfare system that discriminated against them. But the tribunal said the new proposal doesn't follow its list of demands from their historic 2019 ruling. Cindy Woodhouse is the lead negotiator for the AFN and Government of Canada.
One thing that's really clear is that I think everybody knows that these kids and their families, their parents, the children affected by Jordan's principle and their families, all these people, 300,000 people that are waiting for compensation, we need to get that money out to them as quickly as possible because they've been waiting for far too long.
Canada will seek a judicial review of a recent ruling from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. The CHRT refused to endorse a $20 billion deal to compensate on-reserve First Nations children who are subjected to the discrimination within the child welfare system. APTN's Tamara Pimentel has reaction.
The deal was meant to compensate thousands of children and their families who face discrimination within the child welfare system. But in October, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal refused to endorse a $20 billion deal proposed by Ottawa and the Assembly of First Nations. The tribunal said the new proposal doesn't follow the spirit and intent of the original ruling it made on the same case in 2019.
Compensation is supposed to be a symbol of recognition of the injustices that someone has been through.
Cindy Blackstock initiated the case that led to the original 2019 CHRT ruling, which would have paid $40,000 to each eligible First Nations child. She says the new deal proposed by the AFN and the federal government would leave thousands of kids and their families right out of the picture.
I'm disappointed that there's going to be more litigation on compensation. There are already 3 legal orders for Canada to pay the compensation to the victims. So Canada should just move to pay it instead of more fights in court. To me, this type of action is inconsistent with Canada's pledges of reconciliation.
Manitoba Regional Chief Cindy Woodhouse is lead negotiator for the AFN and the federal government's new proposal. She says nearly 300,000 children and family members have been waiting too long.
Compensation doesn't solve everything, but it's an acknowledgement of the wrongs that they have been through. They've been through too much for too long, and many of their families broken apart. So we have to acknowledge that in this country, and we have to make sure that these families are compensated quickly and without delay and without people playing politics with them.
Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
RCMP have laid charges following a hit and run at a residential school march in Mission, British Columbia. The incident happened in June and was caught on camera. The 77-year-old driver turned himself into police the next day. RCMP called the lengthy investigation, quote, complex. Numerous people were injured in the hit and run during the march. 2 people were sent to hospital with injuries. 77-year-old Richard Manuel has been charged with 1 count of dangerous operation of a motor vehicle. He's due in court on January 9th. In a Yorkton, Saskatchewan court, it was an emotional reunion for 2 sisters who say they were wrongfully convicted of a 1993 murder. Brent McGillivray has this from Yorkton.
I'm going to be seeing my sister after 18 years of my dad's funeral.
Narissa and Odelia Cuisance met this morning for the first time in 18 years. As advocates and lawyers argued against a publication ban on their upcoming bail hearing, Odelia says the media should be allowed to continue to report.
After 30 years, sitting in prison every day knowing that we don't belong here. It's cruel and unusual punishment for us. It's 30 years. Like, I was 21, now I'm going to be 51. I hope that they lift that ban today.
The sisters have spent 30 years in prison for the murder of Joseph Dolph, though their cousin Jason Cashane confessed both during the trial and during an APTN investigates 2 years ago.
I stabbed him and beat him up.
The Crown brought the application for the ban, saying it may affect the possible new trial should the federal government find a miscarriage occurred. This delayed the bail hearing to the new year. Chief Lee Ketchamonia of Kiskous First Nation says having media attention would help.
The community supports the sisters. They've served a considerable amount of time, and like I said, there was somebody that admitted to the crime, and like I said, they've always maintained their innocence. So, I think the media coverage would have helped keep it in the spotlight. Like a lot of people back home don't even realize that this is going on. Mm-hmm. If it wasn't for the Kuzan sisters, notifying us, nobody would know about it.
He said, often Indigenous people are treated unfairly by the Saskatchewan justice.
Odelia and Naresha, they have always maintained their innocence, and when somebody confesses to a crime, you'd think it's an open and shut case, but a lot of times First Nations people they tend to get a raw deal when it comes to a lot of the justice in Saskatchewan, and I think that has to change.
Dolph's family was present during the hearing today. APTN and CBC, as well as the woman's lawyer, James Lockyer, are fighting the ban. Odelia says she is hopeful today's hearing will result in continued public coverage of the case.
Saskatchewan knows that me and my sister were wrongfully accused. The truth is coming out, and whether, the outcome today, I feel that we are still going to get justice.
The hearing wraps up tomorrow.
For more, go to our website at aptnnews.ca. A nationwide shortage of liquid cough medicine has parents with sick kids scrambling. In Nunavut, the challenge is bigger. You can't just pop over to the next town to check their pharmacy, not without getting on a plane. This was the scene in Iqaluit today. There is just no children's liquid cough syrup to be found. Nunavut health officials are calling it a temporary shortage and have weeks of medicine available at health centers. As for why this is happening, supply and demand, according to Nunavut's health department.
It's related to the increased viral illness that's being seen across the country. That has placed increased demand on these medications to help children in the country, and that's placed a strain on the available supply.
We have to step aside for a short break, but still to come, a residential school survivor claims he was sent to residential school well before he was officially enrolled as a student. Welcome back. It's National Addictions Awareness Week, and in Yellowknife, youth are front and center in the conversation. Our reporter Charlotte Morit-Jacobs hit the streets to learn how participants are supporting those using substances and or living with addictions.
Colleen Hardesty is doing her part in sharing information around drug and alcohol prevention, harm reduction, and recovery. Her sign reads, "No justice, no peace."
I wanted this side to kind of represent the systematic side of life as we know it, and how I wanted to focus more on what causes people to have addictions rather than the people themselves.
She's one of dozens of youth participating in a wellness walk in downtown Yellowknife. Organized by the Tree of Peace, the event is part of a National Addictions Awareness Week.
Or a lot of people doing the type of addictions awareness work might have some conditional love for those that are dealing with addictions and that are currently using. And I personally quit drinking alcohol, but I'm not completely sober. I use other substances sometimes, and I'm quite open about that. It's harm reduction. It's
I think there's a stigma involved thinking like when you're not okay, it's like you're unstable, if that makes sense. And I think like being aware that it's okay to feel other things that are not like considered positive. Recovery is hard, regret is harder.
The image that we've selected for the event is this heart here with the medicine wheel inside of it. So really to showcase that the event is all about wellness through the medicine wheel, and then also the heart to show that theme this year, which is a community of caring.
Indigenous youth worker Christina Moore says with no residential treatment center in the Northwest Territories for addiction services, Indigenous organizations and non-governmental organizations have been picking up the slack to provide wraparound services for those seeking help.
I think long-term funding would be helpful for sure so you just get a program started off and then the funding runs out. So it would be nice to continue that with that momentum and have like multi-year funding opposed to just kind of one-offs.
Organizers here hope the walk will provide an opportunity to learn more about northern-based solutions.
Building like a supportive, caring community, so having those conversations during the walk and then having them continue after the walk.
Charlotte Mort-Jacobs, APTN National News, Yellowknife.
It's an issue that's been on the mind of one residential school survivor for over 60 years. Roy Johnson, a survivor from the Yukon, claims he was sent to residential school well before he was officially enrolled as a student. While the documents that could back up his claims have likely been lost to history, Johnson says he won't stop looking for answers. Here's Sarah Connors with that story.
Because that's me right there.
While looking through a scrapbook on the former Chutla Residential School in Carcross, Yukon, survivor Roy Johnson recalls the atrocities that were committed against him. Over 60 years later, he still remembers the many abuses he suffered, like being beaten with his own belt by the principal.
That was my first experience with him. Would be many more after that.
According to federal documents, Johnson was enrolled as a student at the school from 1957 to 1964. But he argues that's not the case. Johnson says he was sent to the school at age 4, 2 years before he was officially enrolled as a student, and he wants to be compensated for that time.
This is suffering.
Johnson is a Tronduck-Witchin First Nation citizen from Dawson City, Yukon. He was sent to Edmonton's Charles Camsell Hospital at age 2 to treat tuberculosis. He says he returned to the Yukon and was sent directly to the school in 1955 at age 4. But his official enrollment was not until 1957. Johnson recalls at the time he was too young to be a student.
In the classrooms, I was babysitted by the teachers. I would sit in a corner.
Johnson claims he suffered horrific abuse in the 2-year time span before his enrollment. The most damaging incident happened at age 5 when he claims he was raped and threatened by another male student.
Someone told me, forget about it. Can't. A 5-year-old doesn't want to. Because he knew what happened to him.
Johnson says he experienced more abuse before he left the school nearly illiterate at age 13 in 1964. Documents show he received compensation under the Common Experience Payment Program in 2004 for the time he was enrolled as a student. But with no documentation confirming his 2-year stay at the school before his enrollment, he's been unable to receive compensation for that time.
Well, I think it's pathetic because I spent, 9 years there.
Undated documents from the Charles Camsell Hospital in Edmonton state Johnson had chickenpox in February of 1955 and would be considered for discharge in 3 months. However, it doesn't provide the date of that discharge. In 2010, Johnson appealed his compensation denial and attempted to restart the process. Both applications were denied, with one stating there is no evidence to suggest underage children were sent to the Chutla school at the time.
It's one of the struggles we've noticed for a number of survivors.
Kayla Johnston is the supervisor of education, outreach, and public programming at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. She says it wasn't uncommon for children to be sent to residential school before they could be enrolled as a student.
So we do know of cases, or at least I have seen in some instances, children being placed in the school as a means of protection or maybe to avoid TB.
But with countless records now lost or destroyed, Johnston says many survivors in similar situations didn't get what they deserved.
I've heard lots of experiences of those who couldn't prove they were at the school. And although survivors were supposed to be given the benefit of the doubt, they weren't.
Your legal recourses, I think, are approximately zero.
David Patterson is a lawyer who specializes in Indigenous law. He says Johnson's chances for getting compensation are long gone since his particular settlement program ended years ago.
At this point, there is no process to reconsider the matter. Everybody's closed up shop and gone home.
Patterson says legal action is likely the only option for Johnson, though he's unlikely to have success.
You have what at the end of the day is a legal process, and sometimes complicated legal process that individuals were brought into and often didn't receive the results they wanted, and the mechanisms for challenging that were obscure and complicated, and especially if you go to court, somewhat difficult for an individual to do.
I tried, but I didn't think it was, appropriate.
As for Johnson, he's continuing his search to locate records that validate his experience. He says he's speaking out now because of the discoveries of the thousands of suspected unmarked graves at various residential schools.
When they found all the children buried, I think at the time I was quite angry that they found children younger than me.
While it's unlikely he'll ever be compensated for the time he spent at the Chutla school before he was enrolled, Johnson hopes by sharing his story, he'll one day get the apology from the federal government he feels he deserves. Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
Time to step aside one final time. Still ahead, a Cree Soto singer's special rendition of O Canada in Cree, French, and English. Welcome back. It was a powerful moment. A Cree Soto singer sang the national anthem at the Grey Cup football game last weekend. Tegan Little Chief is from the White Bear First Nation in southern Saskatchewan. She kicked off the final between the Toronto Argonauts and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers with a powerful rendition of O Canada in Cree, French, and English. Little Chief was named the Indigenous Artist of the Year at the 2022 Saskatchewan Country Music Awards. She has sung the national anthem at other games, but this was her first Grey Cup, and her first in 3 languages. She has been working on her Cree lately, and blending the 3 languages together for O Canada was a challenge she was willing to take on.
I have a Cree teacher here at White Bear, and, we had started working on it. And then a few days later, he messaged me and goes, "Can you sing it in English and French?" I said, "Yes, of course I can." I had taken French in school.
For over 4 decades, the Yukon government has been working to grow the territory's permanent art collection. With hundreds of pieces in the collection, it represents the very best of what the Yukon art scene has to offer, especially when it comes to First Nations art. Here's our reporter Sarah Connors with a look at this year's new acquisitions.
It's art that has viewers stopping and staring. These pieces are part of Disorientation, an exhibition at Yukon Government's main administration building in Whitehorse. The exhibit features 16 new acquisitions to the Yukon Permanent Art Collection. Each year, artists submit their work for selection, like Ta'anquatchon Council artist Jared Kane. Kane carved this piece, Raven and Creek Mother, which is a tribute to his late great-grandmother.
So the raven on the bottom represents me. The woman represents my great-grandmother, and the salmon represents her teaching me about the salmon, how important the salmon were to our people.
Kane is one of 5 First Nations artists whose work was selected this year. He says the territory's art collection needs to be reflective of its original people.
Because we're on First Nation land, for one, and it's really important.
Other new First Nations works in the collection include illustrations by Tahltan comic artist Cole Pauls and photography by Northern Shoshone artist Crystal Silverfox. Calvin Moorberg is a Tlingit carver behind this piece, The Eagle's Feast. He's hopeful his work will raise awareness about declining Chinook salmon numbers.
I strongly feel that we, as artists, need to continue to push these issues front and center through our work.
People are excited. They're excited to see new pieces. They're excited to talk to the artists. And
Garnet Muthing is the exhibit's curator. She says First Nations art has always been a staple of the collection since its inception in 1981.
It's also a reflection of the artistic and the cultural traditions that are so long-standing here that foster such an amazing arts community.
The new acquisitions join more than 500 other works in the collection by 275 artists. In the coming months, the exhibition will be rotated through public buildings across the territory rather than a conventional gallery.
The reason we do that is so that art becomes part of people's everyday lives here. So we want to put it in spaces where people are just encountering it and enjoying it as part of their everyday happenings.
This year's exhibit will be on display until spring 2023. Kane says he's happy Yukoners from all across the territory will get the chance to see his work.
I'm noticing that a lot of people are stopping in their tracks, and that's exactly what I want. I want them to stop and see our pieces, right?
Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
That's all the time we have for you on this weekend edition of APTN National News. For news anytime, visit our website at aptnnews.ca. I'm Savannah Kelly. Thank you for joining us. Take care and have a great weekend.